Great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Ross McDonald, and I'm a sales engineer here at Stoplight. Previously, I was on the engineering team, working to help build out the product and what it is today. So now I assist our sales and marketing teams, both with the demos and presentations, like the one we're going to be doing today, as well as technical consulting and API evaluations. So if anyone has any technical questions, please feel free to reach out to Tanya and I, so we can start a discussion. Our contact information will be posted at the end of the presentation today. And there's also a Q&A box here in the webinar, so if anything does come up, please don't hesitate to ask.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Ross. So we have a pretty small group today, so we will have some time at the end of the design webinar to answer any questions. So I'll tell you a little bit about the cadence today. So we have just a few slides to sort of set up the story, and I will do those. And then what we'll do is after the slides, we'll get right into the product, and Ross will give you a demo of the product. And this will be the first in a few different webinars we'll have over the coming months, sort of a lead up to some of our new product announcements. So be on the lookout for those invites. And we'll be really casual in this presentation. So this is our first official webinar, so welcome. And so today, what I really want to get across are the key takeaways for this is to understand that the API transformation process really starts with good design. And so we feel here at Stoplight that really design at scale is only possible with the right tools. And the tool that we're going to show you today is really centered around design. And we feel like that is the first best step in API transformation. And so we want to really leave you with that key takeaway is that we want to help involve more people in your team in API design. So if we leave with those three key takeaways, we'll feel like we've done our job here. And just remember, this is sort of the first step in looking at our product. If you want to take a deeper dive faster, please let me know. We're happy to get on a call, give you a trial of the product. So after this, we'll also send out a link to get your own trial of the product so you can actually start working in it. And because you attended this webinar, we can actually give you an extended trial of the product. And we can also put together a workshop for your team to give you some more in-depth knowledge. So this is just sort of the first stop. And so we just want to make sure that you understand that. And leading into that, let's first take a step back and just think about what Gartner says about the importance of the API spec. So if you think about that API spec in terms of the API transformation, really is that first stop. And if you think about how many pieces the API spec really does touch, you think about being on this far left-hand side of design, which is really where we sit, but also thinking about how big that API spec really is and how many pieces it can involve if it's not done right the first time. We think that's important, but we also think that's really just one piece of the puzzle. We think the bigger picture is that the API story doesn't end when it's deployed. So we think about this as a continuous circle. Design, build, run, maintain, support, and update. You put a lot of effort into this design. We want to make sure that you can reuse it, that you can govern it. And you'll see that in our API Design Manager, again, over the coming months, we're going to give you a full platform in order to really maintain and govern those designs in order to not only have some governance over the designs, but also to have some reuse. So you'll see that throughout our product. So let's just take a second. I have two poll questions. This is the first one. I just want to get a sense, and it looks like we have 6 attendees, so maybe this isn't a big enough group for this poll question, but I just want to understand who's on the phone. We want to involve more of your organization. So if we could just take a quick second to answer this poll question, just give me a sense for who's on the call, architects, developers, central IT, and just tell me who in your organization is on this call today. It will only take about 10 seconds and then we'll move on from this. Oh, perfect. And if it's none of the above, that's fine as well. So it looks like we have some developers, we have a business analyst. We have, what's interesting is that we do have a piece of our product for all of these different pieces of the organization. We feel like some of our customers, and including one of our customers, Credit Archaea, who was quoted as saying that they want to involve more people in the design of the APIs. If they feel like the product manager should really own that piece, and that was one of the reasons that we've designed our product this way. Awesome. Thank you guys for answering that question for me. It looks like we have 5 of 6 answered, so that's perfect. Awesome. Thanks for that, Ross. So moving on from that, so if we were in a perfect world, I'd say, you know, we had one API and we could maintain it with detailed and accurate specifications. We could reap the rewards of AutoDocs and SDKs. But we all know that we don't live in a perfect world with one API. We have lots of services to maintain. And I think this is really more the reality. With macro trends like microservices and containerization, scale really becomes an issue. And we've seen that in our business. And that's one of the reasons that we feel like a text editor is just not good enough anymore to maintain and design your APIs. So with that being said, my second poll question is really around how many APIs is your organization managing? So if you'll take just one quick second, this is my last and only poll question around how many APIs that you're managing. And if you don't know, that's fine. And it just, I've got some big buckets of API designs and APIs, you know, 1 to 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 100, just to give me a sense if this is really your reality. One of our customers have told us, one of our customers is Deutsche Bank, and they've told us, you know, one of their problems they came to us was they were managing 400 designs and then, you know, 10 different variations of that design. You can see that scale really becomes an issue quickly when you're dealing with those sort of problems. Again, one of those good reasons to use our product. So as you can see, Stoplight was really purpose-built around that critical piece of API transformation. And if you think about where we sit in the stack, so planning, when you start that API transformation project, really planning is the first stop, but then you have to take those plans and design, and that's where Stoplight comes in. The build run for any of our Axway folks on the line is really where they sit. So if you think about building and running those APIs, you can push those designs right into your API builder and manage those there in the bottom stack. But really, we think about the importance of API design being up at the top. And so what we're going to do today, and again, this is the end of the presentation, and we'll hand it over to Ross, is really focus on our API design manager, focusing on the far left piece, which is the create piece. Now, through these webinars, we will focus on creating, validating, mocking, testing, document, and we'll show you the power of really having that in one product. So we know that in the space, there are multiple products that do all of these things. We're going to show you the power of really having that in one product, that you can govern the styles and actually have that more exposure to your team. So the focus of today's webinar really will be create. And with that, and I really appreciate your answers to the poll, I will hand it over to Ross and let him jump right into the demo portion. Now, we'll have plenty of time for questions. It looks like we have something in the chat, so we'll answer that. Oh yeah, absolutely. We'll share. We'll reshare the replay link to anyone who registered for the webinar, so no problem with that at all. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Ross. Ross, do you want to take it from there?
Sounds great. Thank you, Tanya.
Mm-hmm.
Let me share my screen here. Okay, great. So for anyone who hasn't been in the Stoplight tool yet, what you see here on the screen is the Stoplight Designer. And so this is a purpose-built IDE, or integrated development environment for APIs and a lot of the supporting material that goes into the APIs, and primarily the specifications. You'll notice here on the left-hand sidebar that we also have a few other sections besides modeling, which is kind of the API modeling for API specs. But we also have the ability to create documentation, which is more for full-on developer portal pages. So, in addition to having the auto-generated documentation for the API specification itself, we also have the ability to have a full documentation site that goes along with that API specification. So you can embed your API spec documentation. Oops. We can embed the API spec documentation into a larger site. So you can tie in other information such as Markdown articles, tutorials, HTML guides. And then below that, we have the API modeling, which I'll jump to in just a second. And then below that, we have the testing, which is, again, tied directly to this API specification, where you can create and generate automatic contract tests for the endpoints in that API spec. And so the primary use case that we see behind that is that as developers create the API specifications, that over time, typically the API implementation, so the actual business logic, that server that's actually running in your infrastructure that's powering that API, and that API spec eventually fall out of sync in very little ways typically. But an easy way to keep them in sync and to just validate that there haven't been any breaking changes to either the API specification, both at the contract level, so things that are actually written to that API spec, or at the implementation level. So as you're building out that API, that you didn't accidentally break the contract that you set in that spec. That this can be used to ensure that those are still in sync. And again, focusing as the API specification as that central point to this entire API transformation initiative, where you can use that API spec to power your documentation. You can have it as part of a gateway integration. You can test from it. And then you also have the ability to mock the API specification. And so just from that API spec alone, you can create a mock server that is just an API that looks and feels and responds exactly like the API specification is documented. And again, we see that primarily as a development tool, so that development teams can work in parallel just from the contract that was agreed upon in that API spec. So you can have a front-end team, a back-end team, and several other teams working just from that API specification, and they can create and use these mock servers to simulate the actual live API, and so that no teams are being blocked by the other as the actual implementation is being created. And we'll touch on these in future webinars. So today we're going to be just focusing on the modeling section here. So I'm going to minimize the files here on the left-hand sidebar. So when it comes to creating a file, we have the ability to also import an existing API specification. So if you already have an API spec that you'd like to import into Stoplight, this is the way to do it, where you can just pull it in from your local file system. In this case, we'll be starting from scratch. And so we can create an API reference. We support both OpenAPI v2 as well as v3. Today, I'm just going to be focusing on API v2, and I'll create just a very simple little demo API to demonstrate what the graphical utility here looks like. So just to provide a quick overview of the user interface here, if you look at the very top left-hand side here, you'll notice that we have a few different tabs: Read, Design, Code. The Read tab is the automatically generated documentation for this API spec. So as we build out this API spec, I'll probably be switching to the Read view here just to demonstrate what the actual documentation will look like. And so the one benefit of the API specification is that you do get this automatically generated documentation site that you can download, send to others, and collaborate on with other users free of charge. So that just from the API specification directly, you get the documentation for free. And so this is a very nice and easy to read consumable format so that you can send this to other developers as if they want to be integrating with their API. As well as during the design process, you can collaborate with business stakeholders, designers, QA, other members of your organization back early and often on the design of that API, and just to ensure that it's meeting the requirements, both from a business as well as a technical perspective. The design view is the actual form-based API graphical designer. And then next to design, we have the code view. And so this is just the raw API specification in JSON format. And so you may notice that other API designer tools usually start from this screen. So you just get either both the code as well as the generated documentation, or sometimes just the code view here, where you can modify the YAML or JSON directly. A few benefits of having the graphical form as opposed to the code-based view here. And really the main benefit being that you don't really even need to know the API specification. So as we're going through the design view here, you'll notice that you don't really need to know what goes into the info object as part of the Swagger spec. And so also you don't need to know the difference between the OpenAPI v2 and v3 specifications, that it's all exposed to the user directly. And so this allows for other members of your org, so not just developers, even developers who may not be familiar with the API spec, but also business stakeholders, product managers, other members of your organization can get involved early in that process and really be integrated into that development feedback loop. And so if I switch back to the design view here, so again, this is the graphical form-based editor for the API specification, where we have a title section for the API directly. We also have the ability to set a description in here. I'll just copy and paste one in here. We have an API host. And so again, these all feed into the info object and the actual underlying API specification. But we don't actually need to know really the underlying details of, this is all exposed to us, and we can really just kind of fill in what we need to or want to. And so we can set the different schemes that we want to support, the different application types. And if I jump back to the code view, you'll notice now that we have a schemes object, we have consumes, produces. And so you're really not limited to modifying or updating the specification in either the design or the code view. But if you know the API specification well enough, you can always jump into the code view, do what you need to do, and then jump back. But they're both updating the same API specification. So regardless of whether you're working in the design or code, you can do that simultaneously. And then also if I jump back to the read view, you'll notice now that we have our host, we have the protocols, everything that I added to the API specification is now being surfaced here. And so again, this is just a real-time view of that underlying API specification. You'll notice here at the very top, we have the save button. So I'll go ahead and save this real quick. And so the left-hand sidebar here, we see security, paths, models, and shared objects. This is kind of just a map of the API specification. So you can see just the different sections that we can add to. The home view is just the API overview. So this includes just information for the API in general. But we can also add security settings. We can add different path elements, models if we want to reuse objects across the API, as well as these shared parameters and responses. And at the very top, next to the save button, you'll notice we have also a few other buttons here. We have the CRUD, path, model, and tag. So the CRUD view is actually for rapid creation of objects that need a CRUD or create, read, update, delete type paradigm. And so this is extremely common in the REST API world. And so just very quickly, we'll go into the CRUD builder where I can create a new object here. In this case, we'll just call it gizmos. By default, it's going to auto-populate the base resource path. So this will be the path within the API specification that this object can be retrieved from. And then we can create the actual object here using our graphical JSON schema editor. And so if you're not familiar with JSON schema, it's another specification that's built into the OpenAPI spec. And so it's a way to just model objects and these typically for request and response type objects here. And so the editor is the graphical JSON schema editor. So much like we have the redesign and code view above for the API specification directly, we also have the ability to create this graphically, as well as if you know the JSON schema format and you're more comfortable using that, you can always jump into the raw schema and modify the JSON directly, if that's something you'd like to do. But so using the graphical editor here, I'll very quickly create a few different attributes. So we'll have a name for our gizmo, an ID, maybe a description. Also create a type here. And you'll notice here on the right-hand side, we have a few different options. Among these options is the validations. So built into JSON schema, we can very quickly create these validations that just enforce a specific format on the objects that we want to be receiving in these fields. And so in this case, we're setting these all to strings, but maybe an ID should be a numeric value. So we'll set this as an integer. And then for type, we may want to pre-fill this option with an enumerated set of values for this type. And so maybe gizmos have specific types. And so if I click into the validations modal here, and under enum, I can add different enumerated values for this. So maybe we have a piece type, component, a part, and object type. And you'll see now here we have a validation. So the string value for type here can only be these 4 strings. And as part of this validation, we also have the ability to set a minimum max character length, as well as a pattern. So you can set a regex pattern in here if you'd like to enforce a certain regex for this value. To the right of the validations, we also have the ability to set read and write attributes. And so this is built into the JSON schema or JSON or OpenAPI v3. But in OpenAPI v2, the Stoplight editor also supports allowing the ability to set either read-only, write-only, or read and write attributes on these objects. And so if I set this to read-only, this means that this ID field should not be in requests coming from clients. So as we create this Gizmos object, we don't want the client being able to set the ID. That'll be set hopefully server side by the backend logic. And so we set this as read-only, is that only the server can return this in the responses. That there shouldn't be any request coming from the client that creates this ID attribute. And let's say we also have a created at value here. And as part of this validation, we also have these formats that are built into JSON schema. And so in this case, I can set a date time format, and as well as we have a few other options in here that are built in. And since created at is hopefully a date time format, I'll set that there. And you can also mark certain objects as required. So if I want to mark these as required, I can certainly do that. And again, if I jump to the raw schema, you'll notice here that this is the graphical view. Need to make it a little bit smaller, sorry about that. This is the textual view of the JSON schema directly. So again, you can always drop down in here and update the JSON schema if you need to. And then if I look at the example, I can also create an example for this object that will then be embedded inside the documentation along with it. And if I don't have an example already, or one that I want to hand create, I can also generate one from the schema here directly. Let me erase my type here. So I'll just throw these in again real quickly. I'll set this again to an integer value, required. And so when I click the create button here, you'll notice now in part of our API specification on the left-hand side, we have a few different path objects. We have both the gizmos and then the gizmos with a gizmo ID, as well as we have a few different models. And if I jump to the read view, we now have an API reference here on the left-hand side. So we have the paths as well as the operations that we can use in these paths. And so each of these operations now has a fully built-in response with an array object. In this case, since we're listing the gizmos, it's going to be listing the gizmos object that we created. And as well as we have the ability to create gizmos directly from the API. And so what this CRUD Builder utility has done is it allows us to create, read, update, and delete this object that we created. And so if you end up having to create multiple of these, so we have a gizmos one. Now if we wanted to very quickly create a gadgets, again, it'll automatically fill this in. If I just add a few attributes here for our gadgets object, we have the exact same behavior. And so now very quickly, we've been able to create and prototype out this API for both the gadgets and gizmos objects that now is pre-built with these different operations for just retrieving, updating, deleting these objects. And so if you find that you do this a lot as part of your REST API design, where you have these objects that you're creating, retrieving, updating, deleting, this is the easiest way and the quickest way to very quickly prototype out an API based on those objects. And if I drill into one of the parameters here, so we have a path for getting gadgets. I can also add a description field here, which includes all of the markdown for this operation. And then below that, I have a response. If I look at the viewer here, this is the same view that we saw within the read view, so as part of this auto-generated documentation. If I jump to the editor, we'll notice that this is actually an array type, but it's creating a reference to this gadgets output object that we have here under our models view. And so the benefit of breaking them out this way and creating the references here is that I can go and then add, if I decide I need to update this object, I can then go and add maybe a gadget name, just as an example here. And if I look at the viewer here, now we have the ID, we have our new field, gadget name, as well as the other ones that were part of the original object. And if I go back to the viewer here for this endpoint, again, it's now the new key is now part of this response. And so any operation or endpoint that's inheriting these models and resources is then automatically updated, and all the corresponding operations and along with the documentation is now automatically updated. If I go ahead and save this, but we also have the ability to reference objects outside of the current file. And so one common scenario that we see within Stoplight is that users will want to create a common file, where they want to store resources that may be used across a variety of different APIs. And so if you're using a microservice architecture, one easy way to model this is you can create a common file for the objects that are used across the multiple APIs simultaneously. And this allows you to both centralize the logic so you're not repeating yourself. So you don't have to go and specify the same user or error object multiple times. But also so that when you update the single location in the common view here, so if I create, just as an example, I'll create a model called error. And so as I go through and I update this, so if I say an ID, error name, error description, I save this here and say, maybe I want to also create a shared response. So we'll say error response. I can create a reference directly to this error object. It's in the same file. And then if I save this, I can then reuse this response in other APIs. And so if you want to have a standard error response that you use across all of your APIs, I can then jump back into the Gizmos and Gadgets API. And just as an example for this list gadgets, I'll create a 400, which is a reference again. And so you can, again, like I mentioned, you can reference objects that are in the same file, but we can also reference other project or other files in the same project. So within this project, I can choose the common file, load the error response here, and you can see it's automatically be imported. And so as I go, and if I decide I need to add more keys or fields to my error object, or maybe I want to remove the name and I just want to keep the ID in the description, then I only have to update them in one place for those changes to be propagated across all the APIs simultaneously. In addition to being able to import objects from the same project, so we have the file, the project, we can also reference an external URL. So you can even import objects that don't even live within Stoplight. So if you'd like to import an object directly from Bitbucket, from GitHub, you can also do that. And of course, all of this could have been done manually as well. And so we use the CRUD builder to create these objects here, but I can also use the path button up here to create a new path. And so we could have specified these dynamically. And of course, we can also add, potentially a status endpoint to this API. Let me check the status. And I can also fill in these values manually as well. But the CRUD builder is a very handy utility for creating these objects that didn't follow the same kind of REST pattern. And then one thing I also didn't do real quick, so under the tags for an API operation, you'll notice if I jump back to the read view, I'll minimize these, you can see we now have our gadgets endpoints, our Gizmos endpoints, as well as the status, all organized by their path. However, if I'd like to organize these in a little bit more readable manner, I can use the tags here. And so if I create a gadgets tag and apply it to all of my gadgets endpoints, if I again jump back to the read view, you'll notice that now all of our endpoints here are grouped under the gadgets subheading. And they're all exposed without having to kind of go through the different endpoints. And so it makes it much more consumable from a user's perspective. Other utilities and vendors also use these tags for organizational purposes, so these can be very helpful from an organization perspective as well. So we definitely recommend using those whenever you can. And so as part of this, we've spent 10 minutes here building out this API, and as part of this, from the API specification, we have this automatically generated documentation which covers all of the operations and requests within this API, as well as the model definitions. And so we can see the actual values that we're going to be retrieving and getting from this API. But we also have the ability to send a test request here directly in the documentation. So as part of this process, you can also send test requests if you have either part of your API already built, or again, we'll touch on this in a later webinar, but you can also have the ability to link this to the mock server. So if you'd like to mock back these responses very quickly as part of this design and prototype process, you can also do that. And so up at the very top here, you'll notice we also have an HTTP tab next to the code view. And if I jump to that real quick, so this is just the NHTTP request maker. And so very similar to kind of a Postman style request and response type form, you can send very easily HTTP requests to a living API. So if you want to send an API or a request to a certain endpoint, you can do that. This will automatically pre-populate all the values from this API specification. So if you already have the API available, you can send them directly here, so you don't have to kind of type them out every time. But another added benefit here is that say that there's an endpoint that we don't have mapped, or that's not part of this API specification. One thing that you can do is you can send a request directly to the API, and then click this Extend OAS from HTTP button here at the top. And this will pull in the results of that API request and pull them in directly to the API specification. So if there's endpoints that have not been mapped, or maybe you don't even have an API specification at all, but you have the API available, one easy way to very quickly construct the API specification and map out that API is using this HTTP utility here at the very top. And so it makes it very easy to both send a test request, and so you can send requests directly to an API that you already have existing, that's already documented here, as well as even endpoints that are not documented in this API spec, if you'd like to pull them in. And as part of that process, it'll also pull in the response as an example, and fill in other attributes and auto-generate all the schemas as much as they can. So it makes it very easy to very quickly create that API specification if you don't have one for an existing API. And so at the very top here, we also notice we have a validation screen. So we have some governance rules and some style rules that we have embedded into the designer that allows you to see different descriptions and objects in this API. As part of the collaboration process, you can also very quickly send comments on this API specification, leave to-dos, and collaborate with other members of this project through the discussion service here. And then we also have a lightweight versioning system that's built into the designer. So if you want to track the versions for these APIs and publish and maintain multiple versions simultaneously, you also have the ability to do that here as well. And that is API design in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thanks, Ross. So now that we've kind of walked through the product, we finished up the official webinar. We want to spend a little time. If anyone does have any questions, we can spend a little time, answering those questions if anyone would like to participate in that. Do we have any questions from the group? Okay. So if we don't have any questions, what we'll do as a follow along, we'll also go, and I'll share this with you again. After this webinar, we'll send out the link to everyone. Please follow up with us if you'd like an additional workshop, or if you'd like an extended trial of the product so that you can actually get in there, because we typically find people who get into a trial will have questions later on once they've actually had a chance to work with the tool. So please follow up with us. And we do appreciate your participation today and appreciate you guys stopping in to take a look. So if we don't have any more questions, then we'll give everyone a few more minutes back of their day. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.